I'm Rebekah Miles. I teach here at Perkins School of Theology, and I'm a United Methodist pastor as well. But this is where my bishop has appointed me here at Perkins. And I'm delighted to be here with y'all doing this spiritual autobiography course today. Spiritual autobiography, writing our faith. And I put writing in there so you know there might be some writing. And again, you don't have to share any writing if you don't want to, but there will be some exercises in writing, stuff that I have found really, really fun. So we're going to talk about spiritual autobiography today. We're going to read some excerpts, like there's a piece from Augustine's Confessions that's in this book, Pilgrim Souls, and there's another account of sanctification from Amanda Berry Smith as she's worried about making her lunch and what's going to happen to the baby and what if her husband comes home. So very female, sort of domestic account. We're going to look at some of those excerpts, and we're going to do some exercises and begin to do some writing. Some of you have already done some spiritual autobiography, but to do some writing ourselves here. I also want us to think together about how we might, if you're interested, I know I am, how I might teach some of this stuff. So for example, I've been coming up with a list of film clips and gathering film clips that might prompt people, be prompts for people to think about spiritual autobiography. I've heard, are you a youth pastor? No? Is somebody a youth pastor? We had somebody in here who's, no? Chris? Chris, you're Chris. Excellent, excellent, good. I've heard that music often works really well. The kids will often bring, youth will bring music when they want to do spiritual autobiographies, and they're working on that. So I'd like us to think of some of those things together as we go along and how we might structure those kind of classes. First, let me talk a little about storytelling. So I read an interesting book, John Gottschall, y'all may have heard it, The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human. And I don't know about you, but I'm from a storytelling family. When my daughter, who's now 16, was 8, she drew a picture of my brain, which is, you just hope your children don't ever draw a picture of your brain. So it was sort of like there was a little brain stem back here. That looks like a speech bubble. And she had, the biggest piece of it was Catherine. That's who she is. And then a smaller piece was her big sister, Anna. And a smaller piece still, her dad. And then there was work. And there was people who I won't name, but my nemesis at work, who's I won't name here, but that was on there, and church was on here. Things Mom thinks Dad should do that he has not done. That was one of the most illuminating, right? Oh, Miles. But probably the biggest circle, in addition to Catherine, was family stories. And I found a lot of this illuminating, and I'm actually so glad that Catherine thought of herself as the biggest part of the center of the biggest part of my brain. But this is so interesting because I think in my family, the way I grew up and the way I've been with my children, the way we learn is through stories. And I know we have wondered many, many times over the years if the stories my father tells are actually true. And ultimately, we've sort of changed our version of what true is, right? Because after they get told over and over again, it's very difficult to determine exactly what happened with these stories. But these stories became the way, both family stories, but also friend stories, became the way that we understood the world. And also, I think, the stories of faith, the stories of the Bible, the stories of people of faith in the Bible and over the course of the history of religious communities. One of the things that Gottschall says is that humans are made for stories. So you may have heard the quote by Elie Wiesel, God made humans because God loves stories. The idea there is God made us as storytellers. And one of the things that Gottschall says and some other people say is that when you put humans in a brain scan machine and you give them information, certain parts of their brain light up. And when you give them a lecture, certain parts of their brain. And when you tell them stories, more parts of their brain light up, and they light up more brightly. And that one of the things that's happening is as we read about or hear or watch on TV, say someone eating or a recipe, the parts of the brain that have to do with eating light up. If someone's solving a problem, the parts of our brain light up as if we were solving a problem. And one of the things that Gottschall says is that the stories we tell are life simulators. You know how pilots learning to fly or getting hours overtime, continuing education, they need to do a flight simulator to try things out before they actually fly the actual plane. That our stories are these ongoing life simulators. They're the way we sort of try things out. And at one level, our dreams also could be life simulators. And I read in Gottschall, and I guessed this for myself, that about 60 to 70% of dreams are struggles, right? We're trying to figure out problems. We're dealing with stresses. And what he says is that dreams and stories, gossip, the way we talk to each other, they're the way we prepare ourselves for life. And with children, they're the ways we prepare them for things that they haven't gotten to yet. It's an ongoing thing. There are other theories about why we tell stories. Some people say that it just developed randomly, that there's no real reason for it. It's just a random development, which I don't know. I find that hard to believe. But in any case, that might be true. My favorite, which is probably not as likely as the life simulator, but my favorite is that, you know, have you seen primates grooming themselves, grooming each other, right? So the idea is that primates, they pick bugs off each other as a way of bonding. It's sort of for social cohesion they're doing this, picking things off of each other. And that at some point when early human primate societies got too big, we couldn't find social cohesion through picking bugs off each other. So instead, we started telling stories. Now, obviously, you can't prove that, right? You can't go back and say, well, yeah, they've stopped picking nits off each other, and now they're telling stories. But I think what that gets at for me, whatever, I guess the random doesn't, but these other explanations, they get at there's something very deep going on with us with stories. And I like to see spiritual autobiography in that context, that we tell stories and not just to entertain ourselves. They're often ways that we find meaning, that we make meaning, that we interpret what's going on with us, including the good things and the bad things. I will guarantee you that I've been intentionally telling my children stories as a way to form and shape them, because they won't actually listen to the life lessons I give them. You know, right? I mean, if I say don't do X, Y, and Z, if I tell them a story, they're more likely to listen. And I know I hear stories better too. I mean, when you do those studies on what people can recall, people have great recall for stories. And sometimes even when people have other kinds of memory problems, they can still remember stories. So what's going on with spiritual autobiography? What's happening when we tell spiritual stories? I'm going to pass this around, and we're going to talk for a minute about what spiritual autobiography is. And I hope I have enough. We have a few more people than I thought we would. So this quote was in the prompt for the class, the little blurb. One of the deep springs of the autobiographical impulse is the effort not just to tell about yourself, but to become yourself. This is Frederick Buechner. And this also sounds to me a little like Parker Palmer, you know. Some of you may know his work. You know, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to be listening to our life when we reflect on our life and trying to figure out who we really are, and then to grow into that true identity of who we are. And as we see, spiritual autobiography is not a simple task of narrating events. In the telling, we become more fully ourselves and are enabled to live out our callings more faithfully. It involves searching for meaning, sorting through various events, characters, memories, and reviewing, interpreting, and rethinking the parts and the whole in relation to God, in relation to our spiritual journey, in relation to our vocation. And one of the things that I found interesting in a couple of things that I read is it turns out that working on spiritual autobiography is really good for people. People found greater acceptance of some of the difficult parts of their lives. They found peace in doing this. My guess is that was like after the fact, right? Probably in the middle of it, it might not have been so peaceful. That's my experience in any case. I quote next Perkins theologian Charles Wood. Some of y'all may know him. He's retired a few years ago from Perkins. And he has this wonderful description of theology as a way of paying attention to God and everything else in its God-relatedness. So basically, theology is simply about paying attention, which I find to be a wonderfully simple and really fitting description of what we think we do when we're talking about theology. It's paying attention to God and everything in its God-relatedness. In thinking about that, then, spiritual autobiography is a way of paying attention to God within the events of our lives and paying attention to our lives in their God-relatedness. And I have a little thing here. You can think of God as a personal God, as many of us do in our faith traditions, or you could have a more vague spiritual power or a lore or what's ultimately valuable, and we can talk about that. I mean, I think of all of this in terms of a personal God who's providentially active in the world, working with and responsively with human freedom. But one of the things I do like about this, and this definition of theology too, is you can think about this more broadly. I have also a definition from Charles Jackson, who's a Jesuit, and the Jesuits have done a lot of work on spiritual autobiography and spiritual formation. It focuses less on the people, events, and experiences, and more on what those people, events, and experiences meant, right, for the person. What's important, and taking all those disparate facets of life, and understanding in their interrelationship, and often the way they discover God and God's presence in all those events in retrospect, right? I mean, certainly there have been times when I did not recognize what God was doing or what I think God ended up doing, and it's only in retrospect as you tell the story. And I'll come back to the Simone Weil in a minute. So they wanted me to list a book, and I really do like this book, but and some of you have it. There are a couple of things I really like about it. One is their typology. They talk about different types of spiritual autobiographies, and they group them in categories. And I disagree with some of their grouping, because that's just what I do. I disagree with things. That's my profession, actually. My children will tell you that. I'm just argumentative. I like the typology, and I think it's a wonderful collection. And some of them are really weird, which I just love. But I think in some ways it's some more contemporary spiritual autobiographies, Kathleen Norris, Anne Lamott, Eugene Peterson, Richard Lisher, they're more fun and more interesting to read, but they're not as weird as some of this stuff, which is I think, a good thing. But this book, they divide spiritual autobiographies up into 4 categories. So they've got wanderers and seekers. That's the first category. So wanderers and seekers are those who are looking for answers, and while they're doing so, they engage in a sometimes feverish exploration of all available worldviews and experiences. So wanderers and seekers. And this is often followed by despair. So they have their sort of Ecclesiastes moment, right? They're trying all these different things, and at some point they think, vanity of vanities, breath of breath. They had this moment where they realize, okay, I'm having all these experiences. What does all this mean? And often then at that point, after the despair, there's a dramatic transformation, and they cast themselves upon the spiritual truth that brings them to their authentic self. Now, I love this description, but I have to say, it often doesn't stop there, right? So they have these experiences, they have this Ecclesiastes moment where they think vanity of vanities, and then they cast themselves upon the spiritual truth, etc. And then I've often found that they still do some seeking and struggling, and I mean, that's true of almost all spiritual autobiographies I know. It's certainly true of, say, Augustine, right? Augustine has his struggles, but they continue at some way. And at some level, Thomas Merton and certainly Kathleen Norris. These are examples that they give in this book of that type. Now, as I'm going to say later, I think in some ways you could think of Augustine's Confessions also under scholars and philosophers, because he does this dramatic sort of seeker kind of thing, this wanderers and seekers. But a lot of Augustine's Confessions is reflection on who God is. So once he gets to a certain point, what eternity is, what time is, I don't mean what time is it, what does time in relation to eternity mean? We'll come back to that. Pilgrims and missionaries. For pilgrims and missionaries, they show an unwavering pursuit of God and holiness. Whatever sufferings or martyrdoms they endure, they remain unvanquished, even rejoicing in the opportunity to display their enduring faith despite trials and adversities. And they put Ignatius of Loyola, John Bunyan, also John Wesley, and I put in Amanda Berry Smith and Phoebe Palmer. because we're going to read some Amanda Berry Smith lately. Now, a couple of things I want to say. So I think this unwavering pursuit, sometimes it's not unwavering. So in fact, that's a part of the narrative, is that when it waves, right? When it does waver, that's a part of the narrative. And even though there is this theme of rejoicing in the trials and adversity, you also sometimes have people who are frustrated with the trials and adversity and would like a little less of the trials and adversity. So this may make it sound a little cleaner and more of an upward perfect trajectory than it actually is. And in fact, that's one of the things I love about these texts, is they're usually pretty messy, right? The really good ones are messy. Why do people love Anne Lamott? Why do people love Anne Lamott? Or Sarah Miles? Why? Or Thomas Merton, for that matter, is Dorothy Day. They show the messiness of and that it's hard, and that we continually screw up. And there's something about that. Why do we like those kind of stories? Because we screw up, because it's not easy. But I do love typologies. They make things cleaner and more orderly than they might otherwise be. Mystics and Visionaries. Speaking of orderly, Mystics and Visionaries is their third part. Their lives and stories unfold in moments of ecstatic prayer and visionary meditation, and often long periods where God is no longer felt. And I added this last part. These accounts often include a lot about the work or the ministries that followed and were nourished from these experiences. So you'll notice in a lot of the spiritual accounts that where there are these ecstatic experiences, often God is calling someone to do something. So I had this, like, I don't know, maybe 14 years ago, this whole series of ecstatic, like really weird experiences, right? And it kind of unnerved me. So I went and talked to this older friend of mine who's a Roman Catholic ethicist. And I said, is it okay that I'm having these experiences? What's happening? And she says, if I were you, I wouldn't be worried so much about the experiences. I would be worried about what God is fixing to ask you to do. So some people see these experiences as sort of fortification that God gives for a particular work. So you think of Teresa of Avila in her experiences, and then she had the very difficult task of institution building, really, right? And institution maintaining. That's hard. Trying to reform a church and grow in order is a difficult thing to do. Scholars and philosophers, they demonstrate a lifelong commitment to the discernment of truth through the exercise of the intellect. They seek to anchor spiritual convictions in intellectual certainties and to claim the possibility of a rationally established faith. I love putting Marcus Aurelius here because I think this really fits the Stoics, right? A rational understanding of what faith is and what life is. C.S. Lewis they put here, Simone Weil, Viktor Frankl, and a number of others they have here. I think Flannery O'Connor is here. She could be elsewhere as well. Again, I find this very helpful, and I found it helpful as a way of looking for themes in spiritual autobiography and thinking about in what ways my spiritual autobiography is like some of these. I've also wondered if there are others. So let me just say, historically, certainly a lot of, the first spiritual autobiography is Augustine's Confessions. And then you have a couple of big explosions of spiritual autobiography. One is going on now. I mean, obviously, right? Memoirs and everybody, right? People from all different spiritual perspectives and denominational traditions and faith traditions. But one, you have this medieval. Did I spell that right? Medieval. They really need a spell check on these boards. Is that right? It's I before E, except after C, and there's no C there. Thank you. So there's a medieval sort of explosion, and often these are those mystics and visionaries. And often they're people who are in religious orders, and they're under spiritual direction, and their directors ask them to write an account of what it is that has happened. And so that's true of St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, any number of other people. And then you also have this sort of, let's see, a kind of a Protestant, Puritan, pietist strand. So starting really in the 16th century, it becomes, people write these accounts of their movement from awareness of sin, repentance, crisis, existential crisis, conversion, right? Growth in Christ, struggles, sometimes with the devil, sometimes with sin, sometimes with the sinners around them. You also have this in some of the pietist traditions, like, for example, I'm a United Methodist. There are in a lot of the Holiness Wesleyan traditions, both in England around John Wesley's time, and then again in the 19th century. You find these extraordinary accounts, and a lot of them are deeply theological. In fact, Ted Campbell has this wonderful article. So some people have said Wesleyan theology is really, they've dismissed Wesleyan theology throughout a lot of its history in the United States in particular. What he says is you really need to look at these first-hand accounts of the spiritual life, and they're actually works of theology. And often these center around, not always, but often these center around something called the order of salvation. And this is simply a way of understanding how it is that God works in humans' lives. So this is sort of a Christian. Reformed people and Wesleyans tend to like to talk about order of salvation, but they tend to have a certain kind of a certain rhythm and a predictable plot structure with things like agonizing over being a sinner and enjoying it, being a sinner and not enjoying it quite as much, or still enjoying it but thinking you probably shouldn't be enjoying it and feeling a little guilty about that, turning away from sin, feeling the sort of a pull of God on your life and recognizing that in your past, being led along by other saints who are further along in the journey, having some sort of conversion, sort of turning point, and then an ongoing struggle with what it means in the life of faith, right? And you find elements in that too, but it's not as formulaic as it is here. Now, there's a wonderful book I like, an article by a man named Richard Bell about deathbed narratives. So I love deathbed narratives and have only been at a few myself, a few deathbeds, and that's a part of this tradition here. And there's a wonderful article. So what you find, so John Wesley collected these stories and he put them in the Arminian magazine. And a scholar named Richard Bell has studied them. And what he discovered is over time they became more formulaic, right? That became a more established plot. And one thing he said is that people were learning that the Arminian magazine and the storytelling was teaching people how to tell stories about death. And that's true. It's also possible that those stories were teaching people how to die and teaching other people how to accompany those who are dying, right? And I wonder with these spiritual narratives, on the one hand, they do become sort of formulaic over time because people are learning how to write a narrative in a certain way, right? But I also wonder if people are also learning to experience God in a certain way. And I think that's certainly true for a lot of the Wesleyan Methodist narratives, a lot of the Anglican narratives, that people over time are teaching, they're learning so that the spiritual autobiographies then become not only a person working out what the heck happened and what the heck is happening and where they're going, but it's also a form of ministry, right? And sometimes people will say that in the introductions. One of the things I often say, why does it matter? Why would you need to know, have a formula, have things that are likely to happen? Well, one of the things I find, especially among these pietists, there are these wonderful 19th century narratives from holiness women. Some of them were different kinds of Wesleyans and Methodists, and later on, other groups. But they would often say when they're going through, especially the early stages, and they're trying to figure out what's happening, when they talk to somebody else about this way that salvation tends to work, they often will say things in their narrative like, I talked to sister so-and-so. They call each other sister and brother. I talked to sister so-and-so who explained to me that as you're moving toward, they don't say it quite like this, I'm just real in my head, so this is just, go with me as you're moving toward, right, along this process, that you often deal with these crises of extraordinary guilt. And it's actually a good sign, right? So what they often will say is, if I'd just known that sooner, it would have been helpful. And now that I understand, now I know how to respond. Does that make sense to you? that it becomes helpful then to know how it is you might respond if you see models of other people who've been in the same place. Again, when I had these really weird mystical experiences, well, first my spiritual director told me not to read anything, right, for the first couple of months, which I lasted a couple of weeks, which I thought was really good. But I found these accounts really helpful. And because of that, because I was in the middle of the experience and I didn't really know what to do with them, I didn't know people who had similar experiences. So to read accounts of people who'd had similar experiences and have them interpret them because they'd been living with this for over time, that was really helpful for me, right? And I think that tends to be true. If you are, that a lot of this process of whether you think of it as salvation or you think of it as life with God, there are struggles. And a lot of time when you're in them, it can be very difficult. Let me just give you an example. So when I was pregnant with my first daughter, I was due in October 98, and I joined an online group of a bunch of other women who were due, all of us, in October 98. Can you begin to see where there might be a problem there? So we were all going through the same things at the same time. We all had the same fears. We were all having the same tests. Some of us lost babies. And we really weren't the best group to give them consolation. And I really felt bad about that because there were ways that people were sort of excluded because the October 98 women were kind of completely freaking out, right? What happened then is some people who had already given birth to babies and had already been through this several times got on there and said, hey guys, it's going to be okay. You know, and so for some it wasn't. Or let me help you. I lost a child too. Come talk to me. Or I know you're doing this test and here's what's going to happen. In the same way, if you've got somebody who's in crisis, whether you think about it as a process of salvation or a journey in God, it really does feel like a crisis. And if you've got a bunch of people in the same place, it can be difficult. Whereas if you have people who've gone through that, they can be helpful. And so I think a lot of these narratives are like that. And my guess, if you think about, we talked about the wanderers and seekers, the mystics and visionaries, the pilgrims, I think a lot of these texts are mystics and visionaries. And a lot of these texts are the pilgrims. What is it? Pilgrims and, what's the other thing? Pilgrims and missionaries. But I also think, you know how, do y'all ever look at psychological typologies? You know how they're helpful to a point, and then they sort of fall apart? I think that's true of a lot of these categories, like the pilgrims and missionaries, the wanderers and the seekers, the mystics and visionaries, the philosophers and the scholars, do I have it right? Those people who are talking about this order of salvation. So you can think of this as sort of a pilgrim kind of narrative, that they're helpful to a certain extent, but that often if you have somebody like Augustine who's writing a really, really long spiritual autobiography, like the first and the really, really long one, you often find them moving through multiple aspects of this, right? There are moments when they're philosophers and scholars. There are moments when they're mystics and visionaries. That's certainly true for Augustine, and he's having these extraordinary experiences. Okay. Do y'all have questions about this part before we move on? Yes, ma'am.
You actually said there's another explosion, and there has been one, I think, probably in the last 50 or so years.
Yeah.
Where would you put that in that time?
Well, so if you look at what you've got on your handout, so you've got the Wanderers and Seekers. I think there are a lot of Wanderers and Seeker books, right? So some of the ones I mentioned, Anne Lamott, Sarah Miles, you know, there are these a lot of talk. Kathleen Norris you could put in there. There's Wanderers. Too many E's I stuck in. Wanderers, no, not an R. There you go.
20th, 21st century is basically wanderers.
Yes, and I think that's something about this time, you know, that we have a lot of wanderers and seekers. And I think because so many people in our time feel like wanderers and seekers, this is, I think, a very helpful. You have some, you know, mystics and visionaries. I'm trying to think of some people like, okay, for example, you could put Sarah Miles here, but Sarah Miles has this extraordinary experience. This is the book, what, Take This Bread, I think it's called. She has this like mind-blowing experience when she walks into an Anglican church. She walks into this church and she takes communion, right? And something extraordinary happens, right? So Episcopalians and Methodists and Roman Catholics believe, and Lutherans, many others believe something really extraordinary is happening in communion, that Christ is really present in some way, and they disagree about what way, but whatever. But whatever happened, she had this extraordinary experience of taking Christ in that moment. And really, that's not spelled right either. This is why I do hands. You know, there are probably just so many misspellings, and my handwriting's not very good, which is actually a great way of hiding. Oh, forget it. You know what I mean. So I think you do have mystics and visionaries, pilgrims, and what is the second? Pilgrims and missionaries. Yeah. Well, you know, I think this is a good point. I think. I'm trying to think of some of the narratives. You could, again, thinking about Sarah Miles or Nadia Bolz-Weber, they have some of this, and their early life is this, then they have some of this, and then they go on this, right? They have these calls to do stuff. So in Sarah Miles' case, it's to start this food pantry, and I've been there. It's an amazing thing, this food pantry where anybody's welcome, and it's run by volunteers who've been a part of the thing. And it is crazy. I mean, it's an amazing place. And you get a sense of that in her book. So in some ways, she has this wandering, she has this extraordinary experience, and then she becomes, right? And she probably wouldn't call herself a missionary. But certainly what that's about is being called to a particular work, right? And oddly, God seems to call people to particular works. At least a lot of us in our traditions believe that. And then this philosopher, what is it, scholar? You know, I think a lot of times people, as they're older, begin to ask these big questions, right? I mean, my dad's 87, and he's asked some big questions all along, but he's asking questions now like, what really mattered? Was I really called by God to be a pastor, or did I just want? It's 5 minutes. I wasn't supposed to do that. 5 minutes. What was the meaning of my life? What's death like? What's death like? What's the meaning of death? What's that going to be like? So I think in some ways this is a developmental thing that a lot of people at some point do this. You also have a bunch of people who specialize in that, right? Like at Perkins is full of people who specialize in that. So I sometimes tend to fall here, and that's precisely why my spiritual director, when I started having those experiences, said, Becca, don't read anything. She didn't say, I recommend that you don't read anything. She says, Becca, do not read anything. Do not read anything, because that's my go-to place. I don't understand something, I'm going to read a book about it. I'm not going to go pray about it, I'm going to read a book about it. And I found that helpful at some point, but I think she was right. And you know, it may be true that at some level, part of the spiritual life is taking on some of this. So for example, at some point, missionaries, that's really wrong. Mission, yeah, exactly, you know, missions, something or the other. That at some point you want people who have extraordinary experiences to have a sense of mission, right? And you want people to have moments of reflectiveness. And some of us are better at some of these things than others. And some people have these experiences and some don't. And most people who have them, they have them for a while and then they go away. Why do I say that so strongly? Isn't that a part of those stories? You have them and then they're not there, but you still have calling to do things, and you know God is still there even if you can't feel a blasted thing. Yes, ma'am.
I think, and one of the reasons I'm here, one of the most difficult things, I've been trying to write a memoir for probably 20 years. And I'm a journalist, so I've kind of been in the role of philosopher, scholar, telling other people's stories for many, many years. And this, what's enlightening me about this is my problem, the reason I'm stuck all the time, is because it's not easy to move from area to area. So I'll start out in my brain writing like a philosopher, scholar, kind of a memoir story which kind of proves it all is real and happens. And then you move into the other. They don't blend well in one story. So it's kind of, my struggle has been, which brain am I in? Am I the mystic today or am I the scholar? And you lose a clear voice.
This is extremely helpful, right? Because I tend to go here, but that's not the vivid, this doesn't tend to be the vivid description of what the heck's happening. This tends to be the reflection after.
But it contradicts each other sometimes. Because if you're the wanderer and Lamont struggler, but the next morning you wake up and you're really the philosopher scholar, it's very crazy making. So you can't really write well when you try to put them together.
So that's very interesting. So part of the issue then in spiritual autobiography is figuring out from what perspective you're going to write, at least for a time.
I was going to say,
Bev,
It feels like there's often a hybrid.
Yeah.
Because you talk about Leo Tolstoy, like he used novel to
Yeah.
like write his spiritual autobiography in so many ways.
Yeah.
So it's like these are not clean.
Yes.
You know, they're more like mixed up together.
Yeah.
I think that's more helpful because I think I don't fit in any of those.
Yeah. So what do you fit into?
I don't. If I had to pick,
I mean, you can make up some.
yeah.
I'm all for making up some, so think about that.
I would say pilgrim or missionary if I
Yeah.
had to pick one, but
Yeah.
that doesn't feel like it really is totally descriptive either.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
especially the unwavering piece.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, a lot of the stories about these, there's a lot of wavering.
Yeah,
That's
I
what
like
makes the
that.
plot interesting.
That made it a little
There was no wavering, it wouldn't be very interesting. We'd still be reading them.
Oh, I just
Yeah.
said one
Yeah.
more thing about that. You're supposed to have a voice. I've been to memoir classes.
Yeah.
And you have to have a voice that's a thread all the way through.
Yeah.
But if your voice keeps changing, you've got multiple personalities in one memoir.
Yeah. Which is maybe because we have multiple personalities in one life.
Well, you do.
So maybe,
That's why it's hard
yes.
to do.
So this is very helpful, right? Because, I mean, this is an important point, that if you try to write a spiritual autobiography that's totally true to your life, it may not actually be all that helpful for you or for other people, right? Because you're trying to put too many things together,
Right.
and you have to make some decisions about what to do and what not to do. Did you have a, yeah?
I was
Sure.
just- when you said that it ended, like
Yeah.
that, what were you referring to exactly?
Oh, like mystical experiences? Or what ended? These guys, that their experiences often, is that what you're referring to?
The trial ends?
Okay, so it's very common that, like, these medieval mystics. So I was at the University of Chicago doing my PhD work, and a bunch of my friends were in something called the Mystic Group, led by Bernie McGinn, and a lot of them published they specialized in different mystics, and they translated their work, and they did introductions, and they published in that Pilgrim's Press. I'd welcome you to do a lot of writings for women that had never been published. And stupid me, I had absolutely no interest in this, right? Until these experiences started happening. But what you see in these experiences is that people will often have these extraordinary experiences that propel them, right? They propel them into certain kinds of work. And it very often happens, Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, it very often happens that they don't endure with the same intensity. And in fact, you know, it generally happens with people in this sort of path that there is a long sort of dry period. Mother Teresa, exactly. Those writings of despair.
40 years of emptiness.
40 years of emptiness. You have John Wesley. On one hand, he has the experience, and then he says to his brother when he's like in his 60s or 70s, you know, I don't feel anything. I'm nothing but an honest heathen. We shouldn't use the word heathen, but this is several centuries ago. Yeah, I mean, it's many people go through that, and of course, you know, what is a spiritual director or a spiritual guide going to tell you? It's not about the experiences, right? It's not about the experiences, right? You shouldn't be seeking the experiences. If I knew how to seek the experiences, I probably would. It's probably just as well that I don't, right? But I think so. So it's not that God's presence ends. It's that something of that extraordinary sensing of God's presence ends in a way.
So
right?
When it ends, what do you seek after?
You seek after faithfulness. You seek after doing what it is that God has called you to do, and you seek after faithfulness to God.